Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Hello and welcome, everyone, to the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Scottish Consortium for Rural Research, so that's RSE SCRR, Peter Wilson Lecture 2024. I'm delighted to welcome both our in-person audience and those watching the live stream on YouTube. For the first time in its 21-year history, we are hybrid tonight. Woo! So 110 in person and 73 online. So I never know where to look for those online, but welcome those online, wherever you are. I'm Professor Sarah Skerrett. I'm the Chief Exec here at the Royal Society of Edinburgh, or RSE, and I'm also the Scientific Director of SCRR. In my briefing notes, I'm the Chief Scientific Director. I thought I'd take that uplift, but anyway, Scientific Director at SCRR. I'm delighted to be welcoming you to this evening's event on tonight's topic, Food for Thought, Food Security in Changing Times, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But before we get started tonight, a couple of housekeeping items. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if you do hear the fire alarm, please follow the evacuation route shown on this slide, and the RSE staff, who will wave at the back, will guide you on where to go. It's straight out, to the right, and outside the dome. Not inside, because we won't be able to check your names, but outside, thank you. There will be time for audience questions later on in the event. When you have a question, please raise your hand, and a member of my team will bring you a microphone. For the online audience, please type any questions in the chat, and we'll read them out for you. Now on to this evening. Here at the RSE, our mission always has been and still is making knowledge useful. This event is an annual collaboration between the RSE here and SCRR, now in its 21st year. I've been told I should have brought a cake for that. Sorry about that. The SCRR, formerly Edinburgh Consortium for Rural Research, is a consortium of organisations active in research into land, freshwater, coastal and marine resources and their uses, including farming, forestry, aquaculture and recreation. Now, the SCRR Peter Wilson, RSE Peter Wilson Lecture was created in memory of the distinguished agriculturalist and former RSE General Secretary, which is one down from the President, just so you know, Professor Peter Wilson, CBE. Peter Wilson was a former Professor of Agriculture and Rural Economy at the University of Edinburgh. He was elected RSE Fellow in 1987 and by 1992 was serving on the Council, which is the RSE's governing body. With almost a decade of unstinting service, it was entirely fitting that the Society's Bicentenary Medal was awarded to him in 2002. This is an award reserved only for those who have given outstanding service to the Society. Following a short illness, Peter died on 29th of January 2004. We are honoured, therefore, to welcome Peter's grandson, Mike Lewis, who is joining us for this evening's lecture. Welcome, Mike. Moving on to tonight's event. By 2050, the world must feed 2 billion more people. Achieving food security means that all people, at all times, have reliable physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. After a period of progress in the number of people living in food insecurity globally, the situation has worsened again over the last few years due to growing climate and other environmental shocks, conflicts, and rises in food prices in many parts of the world. During tonight's event, Food for Thought, Food Security in Changing Times, our three distinguished speakers will explore innovative strategies towards achieving lasting solutions towards global food security. I'm going to introduce all three contributors, and then the evening will flow with me keeping an eye on the time, and then we'll have Q&A. So our keynote main speaker tonight is Professor Rachel Norman, who's also a fellow here at the RSE. Rachel is Professor of Food Security and Sustainability at the University of Stirling. Rachel's research focuses on mathematical models of infectious disease dynamics and control. In 2013, she was promoted to the position of Professor of Food Security and Sustainability. Rachel's more recent focus has been interdisciplinary approaches to food security, including community growing systems. Rachel was made a Fellow of the RSE in 2023. Our first respondent is Dr. Peter Alexander. Peter is Senior Lecturer of Global Food Security at the University of Edinburgh. Peter is a Senior Lecturer, I've just said that, just in case you weren't listening. Peter's a Senior Lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. His work focuses on modelling food and land use systems to better understand the social, economic and environmental interactions of supply, demand and trade, as well as the competition for land between agriculture, forests and conservation. Our second respondent is Dr. Wu Huang, a postdoctoral researcher at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh, and Dr. Huang will be joining online. Keep your fingers crossed for the tech, please. Dr. Wu Huang specialised in plant and insect genomics. Her doctoral research at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, focused on developing cutting-edge methods for analysing multi-locus nuclear sequence data in plants for species identification. Previously, she assembled reference genomes for important food crops like potato and cucumber, which enunciated the genomic basis of important agronomic traits in these crops. You can see we have a panel of a keynote speaker and two respondents who complement each other extremely well, given those disciplinary backgrounds. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome tonight, first of all, our keynote main speaker, Professor Rachel Norman. And Rachel, after your stellar speech, if you could then hand over to your first respondent, Peter, and Peter, if you could then hand over in similar style to Wu, that would be great. And I'll keep an eye on the clock so you don't have to. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right, I will time myself because I get easily distracted because it's so interesting. Okay, so I will start the timer, though that's really helpful. So you've read out my first slide already. So we discussed how to approach this, and what I'm going to do is try and set up the problem a little bit and give you a couple of examples of some of the research we're doing to try and solve some of these problems in Stirling, and then I'm putting the pressure on the others to tell you the innovative solutions later. But the take-home message from all of this is it's complicated, and even this statement, if you look at it, it's about people being close to food, being able to afford it. It has to be food that's not going to make them ill, it's good for them, suits their preferences. There's already lots of things to take into account there. A brief sort of, again, repeat of what we said in the beginning, but the population's growing and that's not uniformly distributed. So this graph's a bit old, but on the bottom, there's a more developed countries are the sort of blue line. They're staying pretty steady. And it's places like Africa, China, and India where the population growth's really going to happen. So they're the countries that are going to have to deal with that. So when we're thinking about food security, the kinds of things that we have to think about, and we will talk about this a bit later, but sustainability, so making sure that we're not, that we can keep producing the food that we need to, where it's distributed. So at the moment we have enough food. So even if the population grows, we produce enough food, but it's not distributed well enough to reach everywhere. We'll talk briefly about climate, but more about extreme events, climatic events, and the impact they have. Diseases and pests in the animals are, if we could control those, that would be a way to increase the yield from the food that we grow. Soil degradation, that's sort of linked to the sustainability, but if we keep growing and using the soil, we use up all the nutrients, and there's lots of issues about erosion of soil that we need to solve. Same with water. So we pollute the water. There isn't enough of it. I'm very sad about how much water it takes to produce a kilogram of chocolate, but there's a lot of inputs to lots of the things that we want and eat and use. And food waste is the last example here. So we waste lots of the food. So actually the answer is not to grow more food or to produce more food, it's to use what we've got more efficiently somehow. And therein lies the challenge. But the talk today is focused on the ever-changing world aspect of this. And again, in the introduction, climate change is one example of that. I put a picture of a volcano because I like volcanoes. I'm not sure they're such a big deal. But other environmental shocks are... sorry, distracted myself again. Other environmental shocks are a problem. I will talk specifically about conflict and political instability and the sort of impact they can have, and then disease outbreaks in humans. So if we want to grow more food, if we want to have a higher yield, then controlling disease in animals is important, but you'll have seen the empty shelves. I did have a picture here of people taking lots of toilet roll during COVID. I never understood the toilet roll thing during COVID. COVID had nothing to do with toilet roll. But anyway, the issues with supply chains, we've seen that here, even round bad snow and that kind of thing. So there's all sorts of complicated things that can happen. And so I've got 3 examples I'm going to go through quite quickly, just to give you a very overarching view. But for me, when I start to think about food security from this point of view, there are lots of things here that I hadn't thought about being an issue. So I'm going to look at examples on climate change and the conflict, political instability. So we'll start off with Syria. So this is an old report, and both of my examples are kind of old, but they're reports that have got a lot of detail in them, which is why I'm using them. But everything that's in here would be true for any of the more current issues, and Peter's going to talk briefly about one of those later on. But so this is a report that the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, wrote in 2015, having sent a mission to Syria. So they were in their 5th year of civil crisis at the time. I've got to let me get the phrase right. Non-state armed groups were in control of half the land area. So the government wasn't controlling half of the land. And so there was a huge implication of people who were food insecure or close to being food insecure. So more than half the population was food insecure at this time. Lots of people internally displaced because of the conflict, and then lots of those seeking refuge in neighbouring countries. And yeah, lots of people with poor and insufficient diets. So that's the sort of background. And so how does that affect the food insecurity? So apologies, quite a few words on the next few slides. But if we think about crops to start off with, there's infrastructure issues. So because of the conflict, there was the fertilizer, seed, fuel were all scarce and therefore had high prices. So it cost a lot to grow the food in the first place. Those inputs weren't necessarily reliable, so you get poor quality seed, for example. Then there was infrastructure damage, like damage to irrigation systems. If you've not got fuel, then you can't run your tractors and your combine harvesters and things. But also there's not much labour around. People can't travel to get those jobs, or they are busy in the conflict somewhere. And then there's a sort of deliberate destruction of standing crops. So there's quite a lot of complicated factors going on there, or not complicated, but quite a variety of factors that all feed together to reduce the crops that you can grow. In 2015, the crop production was 40% lower than it had been pre-conflict. So that's sort of a conflict level cause. But at the same time, the weather was terrible. So they had climate issues to deal with. So 2015 was actually a good year, and the couple of years after that, it was really dry, and so the crop production was even worse. So you've not only got the conflict, you've got additional things to deal with as well. If we think about animals and livestock, lots of people rely on livestock for their own food security, let alone for selling and for economic value. And so there'd been a huge reduction in the flocks and herds, so 30% reduction in cattle, 40% sheep and goats. And chicken, which is one of the, or poultry, which is one of the things that lots of people might have in their own garden or in their own house, might be something they produce for themselves. In lots of parts of the world, people rely on poultry as a source of income or a source of food. That's halved. And one of the reasons for that is feed again, so access to pastures limited by both climate and by the security concerns. The feed was expensive again, and that's partly because they weren't growing enough crops. And yeah, that's because of the poor rainfall. So again, you've got all these interacting factors. And then the thing I hadn't ever really thought about, and there are definitely people in the room who will look at me going, surely that's the most obvious thing. But the veterinary service couldn't get access to drugs, vaccines, and so and that in itself is a problem as well. So all that sort of supply line that you rely on wasn't there. And then kind of embedded in all that, or on top of that, you've got transport problems. The government had lost control of the roads, and so people couldn't transport food where it was, so there was bottlenecks in movement. We've already said high fuel prices, so you can't afford to move the stuff, and so they ended up with food being produced in one bit of the country, food deficit in another bit, and they just couldn't do the transportation between those two. So the markets you were relying on aren't there anymore, and they're all become fragmented and broken up. So that's just a few sort of, as I say, very brief overview of an example, but all of those things come together to cause a real problem in terms of food security. And as of last month, 2 months ago, March, we're in May, are we? Are we in May? There were 45 countries who were in need of external assistance for food, according to the FAO, and the reasons for that varied, but they were conflict, weather extremes, low food production. So all these things coming together in lots of different countries, many of them in Africa. Similar set of problems, all doom and gloom. We'll come to solutions in a minute, probably. So again, this is an Oxfam sponsored paper that looked in a lot of detail at some extreme weather events in sort of 2010 or the early 2010s. And I'm going to look at, again, very briefly, one slide each, of a heat wave in Russia and a typhoon in the Philippines, just again to show the kind of complexities of what can happen. So Russia had this heat wave in 2010. They would normally be at about 23 degrees. They had a maximum of 38. This is in 2010. It's got worse since then, as I'm sure we're all aware, these sort of extreme weather events. But the temperature was hot over a really large area. That caused droughts and fires, and they lost a third of their overall wheat harvest as a country. And so the government's response was, well, let's protect our own citizens. We'll ban the export of wheat, which that's what I'd do. If I ruled the world, which, I could. But I'm not sure I should. But sorry, distracted again. So Russia's the fourth largest wheat exporter. And so that's fine, and they protect their own citizens, which they didn't really either. Actually, all the prices still went up. But it had huge implications for other countries round about who relied on that import. And so there was a huge increase in global wheat prices that year, partly at least as a consequence of that, and that led to civil unrest and all sorts of issues. So it's not a straightforward, one country has a problem and solves it. There's knock-on effects all over the place. The typhoon's a slightly different story, but again, this really made me think, because the typhoon lasts a few hours, but it came in and destroyed lots of agricultural land, 28,000 fishing boats destroyed. So that's livelihoods all over the place. The thing that I had never thought about, and I presume you haven't either, 33 million coconut trees. Who knew there were 33 million coconut trees? But they're all destroyed, and the impact of that is really long term. So that's a sort of 6 to 9 year cycle before they can grow them again. So the Russian thing was a kind of longer lasting problem, but it was 1 year's worth of crop. Whereas things like replacing your fishing boat or replacing your coconut trees is a much longer term problem. And that's just for a very short extreme weather event, relatively speaking, which is more or less what this summary slide says. So different types of natural disaster have different impacts, is what I'm trying to get across to you. And they can be geographically far-reaching and long-term. I haven't said why, but often women and children are the worst affected. So 2 minutes I've got and 2 slides I've got just to tell you very briefly about the kind of thing that we do in Stirling. So I'm morally obliged because we have an Institute of Aquaculture to say fish. Fish are very important. And that is because they're very important for livelihoods and rural economies. They are more efficient in terms of a protein source compared to beef or sheep. So I won't go into the detail of the graph, but that's data's convincing, let me tell you. So it's a possible, and it's somewhere where it's possible to grow. So we can't keep using more and more land for grow crops. We can't keep fishing the sea, but aquaculture is often seen to be a route for growth, and it's certainly a growing thing. So if we ate more fish and less beef, that would be a good thing. And finally, one of the projects I'm working on at the moment is about local food growing. And particularly in these vertical growing towers, so they've got controlled light, controlled heat, so it means you can grow all year round, and we're working on a community growing project that's meant to be sort of climate resilient. We're using renewable energy, which is one of the big problems with these controlled environment things, that they take a lot of energy, and trying to reuse nutrients and things. So this is the kind of, for me, the kind of innovative solution that we need to be looking at to try and change our food system and protect everyone's food security. So I shall hand over to Senior Lecturer, was it? Dr. Pittaway. Don't say I never listen. Peter.
Great, thanks very much, and lovely to be here. So I am going to try and go to the next slide. Oh, I'm already getting muddled with the slides. Great, so I'm going to start by just mentioning that shocks to the food system can happen anywhere across that system. Rachel's already covered this through a number of our examples. But, you know, I guess we immediately think of climate events and weather events, and obviously that has an impact on agricultural production. But the food system is much broader than that. We have to think about the food industry, how those products are transported and traded internationally, how they're processed, how they're the retail, the supermarkets, etc. Those economic systems, but also how consumer demand is affected, how consumers' incomes, their preferences, the social systems around those, making those choices, and the political system is also really important, both in terms of geopolitics, but also the regulatory system and the subsidies and so on that govern the sort of the behaviour of the system overall, as well as those environmental outcomes. So we could think of shocks happening anywhere within that system, not just climate and weather shocks. They could be geopolitical, they could be technological shocks, they could be economic shocks. And in particular, I wanted to talk about one example that Rachel's not so far touched on, which would be related to the war in Ukraine, the Russian-Ukraine war. And that created, as we all know, a number of substantial shocks related to the food system. I think the one that's talked about most in sort of the media and public and also policy discourse is the sort of the direct impact on the loss of exports from Russia and Ukraine, because it's the kind of the most visceral and most obvious one, if you like. And certainly, as Rachel was just talking about, Russia's a major, and Ukraine are both major exporters of commodities, particularly wheat. 30% roughly of wheat was exported from those two countries globally prior to the war, and actually more or less to today as well. And obviously with blockades in the Black Sea and other things, there was concerns about those exports. However, there's sort of maybe slightly less obvious indirect impacts in that we had this big shock to energy prices, which was felt through agricultural input costs. So fertilizer and nitrogen fertilizer prices tripled. And obviously that has an impact on food prices directly, but also through higher input costs, but also indirectly again through farmers choosing to use less inputs, less fertilizers, potentially not plant some fields, and that reduces supply, which again feeds through into higher prices. So the question we were trying to ask through some sort of modelling studies is this kind of representation in the debate about the direct impacts, this loss of exports from Russia and Ukraine, is that right? And what the findings suggested is actually not correct, is that the impact was much greater on prices of food from those indirect, from the energy cost implications rather than the loss of exports, because it had a much more systemic effect. Where we were seeing here in the graphs at the bottom, like 5% increase for the loss of those exports, but sort of more like an 80% increase in the price due to a combination of the two. So that in this case and in many shocks, the impact's felt through in higher prices rather than sort of lower availability. It's more that lower affordability, and those higher prices also change consumption of food, so that people choose to eat less, but they also choose to eat different foods. They move away from discretionary consumption of, say, fresh fruit and veg and meat, and they eat more staple products, more cereals, for example. And so both of those things change the nutritional outcomes from that. So in this study, we were suggesting that roughly 100 million additional people would become undernourished under those kind of combined scenario relating to the Russian-Ukraine war. And that would have kind of the consequences of something like an additional 400,000 people per year dying as a consequence of that. So the point I'm trying to make here, is that direct and indirect effects can be quite disproportionate impacts, and sometimes it's not the first thing, the thing you think intuitively might have the biggest impact may actually be most important, and we have to think about these cascading risks. The question on this slide is the system fragile or resilient, the food system? And some people kind of almost axiomatically say, well, we have this very globalized, complex, long supply chain system. That must be fragile, that must be brittle, must kind of fall over easily. And obviously it somewhat depends on your definition, but as a system, as a systemic system, I would argue that actually that complexity and that sort of large scale interlinkages actually creates a form of resilience, that the system can accommodate changes more easily because it's so large, and it can dissipate a change across a bigger area. But that doesn't mean, so the system itself is resilient, but that doesn't mean the outcomes from the system are positive or beneficial. It still, has the environmental degradation, the poor nutritional outcomes, etc. And in a sense, it produces those in a resilient fashion, which is kind of not what we want. And indeed, it also tends to concentrate the harms on the poorest because those shocks are experienced as an increase in price. And obviously, the people who have the lowest incomes are the least able to accommodate that increase and are most damaged by that. So in a sense, the system is systemically resilient, but the outcomes are not what we want. Which brings me on to well, how do we spring ourselves out of this? How do we transform the system? And in 4 minutes. I think it's widely agreed and has been discussed and written about quite a lot, and we've already started talking about it today. We know the system is broken in various different ways. And also it's relatively clear what the solutions are, and I'll come back to that in a second. But that's less contested. But what's much less clear and much less work and effort, I think, has been put into, because it's so hard, is to how do we put that change system into place? And that's very much more difficult. So this is a bit of a complex slide. Actually, this is a simplification of a even more complex slide that, rather unkindly, people have been calling the spaghetti slide. So it's related to work I'm involved with the UN Environment Programme, where we're trying to look at this food system transformation question. And it's trying to sort of enumerate three different things. So going from left to right, the goals, which, as I say, are well understood, and I'll go through in a second, and then what systemic changes are required to achieve those goals, and then trying to move more to what actions are required in order to put those in place. So just to go very quickly through the goals, that it's the things you might expect, healthy consumption, healthy outcomes in terms of human health, environmental, sustainable climate change mitigation, equitable and resilient system. Yeah, fine. So what sort of changes do we need to do to achieve that? Well, the first one here is we need to change our consumption. We need to move away from overconsumption in many countries like ours of animal products. But we also need to change the agricultural production processes to be more sustainable, which is sort of the second square, as it were. And then we need to reduce losses and waste, increase circularity in the system. Novel foods and production processes like vertical farming would be one example as well, and also restructure the food system, thinking about market power and other things of that nature. So how do we do that? Well, there's 5 sort of domains of sort of levers, actions that we kind of identified here. Different actors, but the issue is that for any of those solutions, we need to have all of those actors pretty much in place. So if we think of changing food consumption, yes, it's about our individual choices about what we eat, but we also have to think about the rest of the system. So the food industry is marketing food to us. It's being choice editing about what the foods are provided that we have access to, and so forth. So the food industry needs to change. There's also potential technology changes involved, but which is the third box. But policy is also going to be an absolutely key driver for this. We've got agricultural subsidies that are sort of misaligned and perversely providing perverse incentives for various different ways. We've got, not paying the true cost of foods that we buy. So we have all these environmental externalities that are not embedded in the cost. So we need to think about how policy can change that. But that's not necessarily considered acceptable. We're talking about meat taxes and things like that. Then politically unacceptable. How do we do that? But we need to move in those directions. So even these actions are not really enough. We need to go and understand how do we stop the French farmers, etc. Or how do we make it politically acceptable for our politicians in this country to implement a meat tax? I honestly don't know the answer to these questions. But I wanted to highlight, just to finish, and I am a little bit over in time, but just to finish, to highlight 2 areas of contested areas. So one relates to changes in the agricultural system. So there's 2 sort of contradictory, dialogues. One is, sort of organic, regenerative agriculture, etc., sort of multifunctional land use, where we can produce food and we can produce less damaging to the environment, more biodiversity friendly, etc. But so that's land sharing. On the flip side, we've got kind of more intensive agricultural production to try and limit the area in which we're producing our food so that we can spare other land for biodiversity conservation. And if we try and do the first, we try and have your organic approach that tends to have lower yields because of this multifunctionality. If we don't couple that with dietary shift, then all we're probably doing is exporting the production somewhere else and deforesting the Amazon or whatever it might be, and actually achieving worse outcomes. So it's a big debate about land sparing versus land sharing. How do you do that? And certainly, and it relates to this systemic questions, if you like, about consumption. And very quickly, another one was sort of local food. Is people all think, well, local food's the answer, particularly organic local food, right? But food miles and the emissions associated with transport, particularly international transport of food, is a relatively small, if not very small, percentage of the total environmental emissions. So local food isn't really dealing with the bulk of the problem. It's sort of it's a sort of a minor aspect. So organic local food might sound good, but really we need to be thinking about what the food is, not so much those type of labels. Yes, that's it. So now I'm passing over to Wu online.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I ran over.
That's great. Hopefully,
Can everyone hear me?
yeah, we can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was excellent talks from both Rachel and Peter. I wish so much to be in Edinburgh at the moment, to be in that room. I can already feel the enthusiasm. And just to get started, what Peter was saying about the local growth, I'm going to talk about a little bit different and from a different angle. It's about food security, globalization, about how we have this globalized food chain and supply chain. And to quote what Rachel just said, it's not only about growing more food, but efficiently using what we have at hand. But the case is when the globalization happens, there is a big waste along this supply chain. I'm a very early career scientist, so I'm still at the state of observing and seeing what was the problem is and what others are proposing to solve the problem. I can give you an example of a tree that I
Excuse me, Wu, can I interrupt for a moment? Not everyone can hear you. We think you need to move closer to your microphone, if that's possible, please. Or turn up your volume.
Way better.
Is that
this
better?
Way better?
Yeah, a lot better. Thank you. So if you could hold that up, I know that's annoying for you, but if you could do that for the next 5 or so minutes, we would appreciate it. Thank you.
For sure, thank you. No worries. I'll just go with this. It looks weird, but as long as it helps. I was still an undergrad student, and I visited with a class trip to the border control in Beijing, and we witnessed a case where they were dealing with that day. It was thousands of tons of pomelo and the site where they were detected a type of pests, a potential pests in just several pests in the sample, so that they were destroying the whole ship of it. I was astonished, and probably everyone else would have the same question with me and that side, is that, can we just ship this back? Or can we use it on site in some way? But the question was not. It has to be destroyed due to the regulations or simply because the shipping fee is too expensive. In this case, we can see how big the scale it is for the food waste during this globalization, this market importing and exporting. In the UK, there were 2.3 billion worth of agricultural and fishery products, and simply in the UK every year. And there were over 100,000 cargo ships arrivals to the UK ports and harbours in 2022 for 1 year. The scale is enormous, and the waste there is enormous too. And this is one of the cases where I have observed how the food security could be improved by some simple regulations. And another aspect I have observed there is the food fraud and authentication. On the border control, everything what we were doing is to authenticate them if they were the food, the goods that they were dealing with as they were declared as. And in a large scale, as everyone here probably have heard about the horse meat scandal in 2013. And that scandal led to a surge of food authentication innovations. And these innovations are mostly based on DNA, which I will talk about. I can elaborate on a lot because that's what I have researched on during my PhD. That's using the DNA barcode to identify species. And also the 2008 Chinese milk scandal. That's a type of toxins which can be used to thicken the milk used for babies, which leads to thousands of babies deaths during that scandal. And this was a big thing in China back then, and then that led to loads of policy reinforcements and strict regulations. And the identification based on this would usually be chemical based. So now we have the solution for many of the type of food fraud. What I wanted to bring about on the other side of the globalization of the food market is that now we are paying more attention to the biodiversity of how the agriculture is causing damage to the biodiversity, so that we're proposing the new methods to conserve, to bring harmony into these two areas. What I have observed, for example, in the UK, we have abundant of projects that happen. For example, the agrobiodiversity conservation projects in Ethiopia, leading by Q. Ethiopia, that's where they are mostly growing banana and coffee. And also here we have the oil palm and maize agrodiversity conservation projects here happening here at Imperial, where they are using those techniques to using intercropping techniques to mitigate the biodiversity loss. And another thing which comes nearer to my hometown, that's the agrodiversity conservation, the Southeast Asia rainforest, where the rubber industry were flowering. There are, so this is happening at RBGE, the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, where I did my doctoral research. So those are all the things I would like to report about the problems we're facing. Just to add to what Rachel and Peter were talking about, and also about the solutions, the effort we're having from the scientific, from the community side. And everything we are doing now is trying to ensure that the food security and biodiversity conservation are in great harmony during the globalization. And that would be my point of view. And thank you everyone.
Thank you very much, and for the technical support, including from one of our audience members. Thank you very much. So, Dr. Huan, if you could stay on the line, and then if Peter and Rachel could come and sit at the table, that would be great. Thank you. So we now have 30 minutes for Q&A. We tried this the last 2 years to give a good half hour for question and answer, and we got a good debate going. So I would like to ask you all now, when you ask your questions, if you're comfortable giving your name and institution, because that helps to contextualize where your questions might be coming from. So thank you again to our main speaker and two respondents for provoking us. So it's over to you now to respond with your thoughts. There's a question in the middle there, Talia. Blue shirt. Thanks.
My name is Yusuf from Global Academy of Food and Agriculture Systems, University of Edinburgh. Yeah, thank you. It was very well structured and complementing presentations in a very dynamic mode. Two keywords, global food security and carbon farming, and thereof derived carbon offsetting and carbon crediting. So maybe Peter, but overall to the panel. So what's your opinion on that? Do you see it rather as a threat for global security, thinking it might push the prices up, or the leakage effect? Or you see it as an opportunity, increasing farmers' income to implement some more generative and sustainable practices that might for instance, increase resilience to the negative impact of climate change? Thank you.
Thank you.
Shall I go first? Yeah, okay. It's a tough question. So I think we need to, I want to make a distinction between two things. Between the sort of what we need to achieve and the sort of the policies and the systems and the markets that appear to be developing or have developed as sort of distinct. So we definitely need to move towards practices that sequester more carbon in the soil and vegetation. You know, land use plays a huge role in the functioning of the planetary system. So we need to, you know, 4 per mil, etc., is all great. So that's all the positive side, if you like. We could talk more about that. And then we have kind of the schemes, particularly the voluntary schemes that are often in existence, which are not sufficiently regulated, where the additionality between the projects that are given the credits under those schemes is questionable. I think there was a paper that was out maybe 18 months ago which looked at forest credits, and I think it was something like 20%, or was it 17%? Anyway, it was a small number, were kind of able to be validated some period of time after the credits had been provided. So that if you've gone on your EasyJet flight and you've offset your carbon with those credits, then perhaps, let's say, a quarter of those emissions have indeed been offset. And I think that's probably on the optimistic side. So, you know, we have to. So yeah, I think maybe that's a start off. I can probably keep going, but I'll let Rachel have it.
Oh, I don't know what to add. So, yes, okay, you did then explain what carbon credits were. It did occur to me that I needed some help, perhaps, with that. Did you say something else as well as carbon credits? Did I miss? Sorry. So that.
No, basically that the inclusion of agriculture sector, either in the compliance market or the voluntary market, do we have to be as careful as we are now, like taking it easy because we don't know the longer term effects, or can we use this as an opportunity for farmers to adopt those sustainable and more regenerative practices? So what's your take on this? Like either more opportunist or is an opportunity or is it a threat?
That's a hard question. Okay, I'm going to go back slightly, and so I'm not going to answer your question. As an undergraduate, what I'm going to do is tell you the question I know the answer to, and then hope you give me some marks for it. Is that good enough? I will try and work into this. So I think Peter's already said this. We've got to change practices and use less carbon, but there are some things we will not be able to completely decarbonise, I think. And I think that's where the offsetting comes in. But I think there are some hard decisions to be made before that works. So maybe not EasyJet flights. You don't want that to be used as a guilt, to alleviate people's guilt for doing a thing that they know they shouldn't do. I'm trying to think, because obviously we all want to go on nice flights and do nice stuff. But the end of the day, the bottom line of all that we've just talked about, and I know this isn't quite food, but we've all got to change our behaviour and change our demand and our consumption and how we do things. And we've got to do that a lot and significantly. So if there are positive and effective ways for farmers to buy into that, and there are some, I'm sure, then that's great. But as Peter says, there's lots of less convincing programs or systems out there. And even let's all plant lots of trees is not, that's complicated. Just to kind of reiterate, it's all complicated. But even where you plant trees and isn't necessarily, just planting more trees is not the answer, for example. So I've edged closer to your question.
Okay, who else? Jeff on the front row, and then we have somebody right at the back there with the black cardigan on. So, thank you.
Thanks. Jeff Sim, also Global Academy at the University of Edinburgh. Inspired partly by Peter's spaghetti diagram, where I think it featured in only 3 of the 15 boxes, do we place too much of a burden on natural science research to help in solving these problems? And if so, where else should we be putting some of our public investment?
That's an interesting question. I mean, maybe. So, I was kind of saying that the problems are well understood, the solutions are relatively well understood, and what we're not so good at is almost the political science, the social science, beyond, economics perhaps. And so, yeah, I mean, that's not my area, as you well know. But I do wonder whether we do focus too much on that. And certainly historically, I think the focus in this area has been on production, on how do we have a better cow, and that's great, and that gets you so far, and will continue to get us further, but it isn't enough. So we definitely need to continue doing those things, but we need to have a broader base, and that's broader base disciplinarily, and also in terms of the sort of the actions and the leverage points that we target.
I wonder if, no pressure on you, Dr. Wu, if you don't have any view on that, but just to say, do you have a view on this? If you don't, make sure you interrupt when you do want to give an answer to any of the questions.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah.
I wanted to add something to the first question, if that's allowed.
Sorry, of course.
Because I was thinking about when we were mentioning about the carbon offset, the carbon credit, as well as what's going to be in the biodiversity credit. I think the thing we're using, or we're bringing those things up, is mainly to limit the large organizations' effort. Of course, I'm not saying that everyone's small daily effort is important. It's important, but I think those credits can largely impact the behavior of those large organizations. The carbon credit is it has a big impact on the airline behavior, and the biodiversity credit has a bigger impact on the bigger farming companies' behaviors. And the bigger organizations will take efforts in fighting the loss of biodiversity if they were facing a fine because of the biodiversity, the costs. So I think those regulations, those policies are definitely making a bigger impact if we take into consideration the impact the larger organizations.
Okay, so we're able to hear probably 80% of that. I think you need to keep your microphone right at your lips. I'm terribly sorry.
Right, I'm very sorry.
It's okay. We also have the captions, the live captions going on, which sometimes make for interesting reading. But we did get your point about the fines on larger organisations perhaps having a proportionately larger impact. So thank you for that contribution. So did you want to come back at all, Rachel, on the...
Strong opinion about Jeff's question.
Okay, so Rachel's going to respond in a very strong way, it seems, to Jeff's question.
Who knew? Interdisciplinarity, that's what it's all about. We cannot solve any of these problems. So I hadn't thought about the pressure being on the natural sciences. That's interesting. But if we don't bring all the disciplines together to solve all these big problems, so not just food security, climate change, all the other stuff, then I think we're lost, because we can come up with technical solutions for things, and if people don't want to use them, and there's lots of examples of us going, well, maths is the perfect, you can always do a model that tells you stop eating beef, the the maths definitely shows you, if we all stopped eating beef, that would be the answer. But that's how do we make people do it is the social sciences, how we communicate and use creative arts and humanities stuff to talk to people. It's, yes, or as the bit I love, let's talk to all the disciplines, please. It's very important. Thanks, Jeff.
That wasn't a plant, was it, that question?
Yeah.
But it's
Great.
amazing how hard it is, right?
Yes, it is, because we all speak different
Languages.
and come from different viewpoints. It's very difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have the question at the back and then another one at the front here in the second row. Thank you, at the back.
Hi, I'm Tilly Robinson-Miles, also from the University of Edinburgh. Peter said, in quote marks, policy is going to be a key driver for this. So building on that, which you definitely said, taking
A statement of the obvious, perhaps.
taking a food systems approach, have you got all of the panelists one particular policy ask, which could be a new policy, or potentially maybe developing on Scottish Government's Good Food Nation Act? Maybe there's something that you would want to add that isn't already recognised in legislation to tackle some of these issues. Obviously, we're in the realms of the devolved constraints of devolved government, and there definitely are Scottish Government people in the room, so what would you say to them?
Not pointing any fingers at all.
I'm going first, am I? Well, I mean, first of all, the statement is a statement of the obvious, clearly. Yeah. In trying to frame a response, I guess the question is how deliverable should they be? You know, so I've already started talking about a meat tax, which is an obvious place to start in many ways. But if that's off the table because it's not achievable, then, you know, where on that spectrum of acceptable to you know, not acceptable, effective to not so effective do we go? Yes, it's a tough question. So I don't want to talk about that again. So I'm going to talk about something else, which I suppose would be related more to regulating the industry in terms of how they market food to us, how the industry operates, which is obviously in the purview of policy about how that's done. You know, in terms of, let's say, choice editing. You know, is there a vegetarian or vegan option being provided to me when I go to the canteen? Is that cheaper or more expensive than the meat option? I actually took a photo in the Edinburgh University canteen about 5-6 months ago, where there were two wraps, let's say. There was the I can't remember the details now, but the ham wrap, and there was an identically packaged, identically sized chickpea wrap, and the meat option was 50p cheaper than the chickpea one in the university canteen. And I'm not in the habit of taking canteen photos, but I mean, and I can't. Not only do I think that's silly, but I can't think of an economic justification for that either. Well, the only one I can even plausibly think of is that less people buy the chickpea wrap, but it's pretty weak. So, you know, do we want to have regulation that controls that there's an equivalent not cheap? I'm not sure, but you know, and these are really, I don't know how you would. I'm not a policy person, but you know, I think regulating the food industry more. We could talk about market power as well, but I probably witted on enough, so I'll stop.
Dr. Wu, if you want to respond, can you put the microphone in your mouth, please? Maybe not literally, but close enough. Thanks.
All right. I think I'll spare you and keep this question if that's okay.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks. Rachel, do you want to comment on that or move to the next question?
Let's move to the next question.
All righty.
So I'll just start talking about smoking, which is an entirely different.
So we have a question right at the front, row 2, and then I see a hand right at the back. So we're keeping our microphone colleagues,
Getting your steps
their step counts are up. So Thanks.
Thanks, and I enjoyed all the talks. Thank you. Eileen Wall from SRUC. And I suppose I want to ask a question. Rachel, you picked up on the role of innovation and things that we haven't even thought about. But can I ask, what are your thoughts on the role of innovative solutions for our rural communities in addressing where agriculture is a core part of maintaining not only those communities, but those ecosystems, versus solutions that might fuel sort of more urban industrial demands of agriculture going forward, and particularly about what the role of that rural communities versus urban communities coming together to really understand what solutions will work for our food systems.
Yes, that's a big question as well. So the vertical growing towers, which I'm in some ways very excited about, in other ways seem to mostly grow lettuce or marijuana, seem to be the two options. And I've not tried that on my university yet. But building a growing tower. So for me, the benefits of that are the kind of climate protectedness, and they could have their benefits anywhere. So what the facility we've got is not a multi-million-pound robotic something or other. It's a shipping container with some shelves in. And so, okay, it's not going to have a massive capacity, but it'll let us do some interesting stuff. And that's a community-based system. And what we're trying to look at there is what are the benefits to the community. So there's health and well-being of getting in there and growing stuff. Do we grow the stuff to feed people? Do we put it in food bags and things? Or do we grow basil and sell it to pesto makers or marijuana? So there's all sorts of trade-offs there. So I think that technology transfers. I mean, I said I wouldn't doom and gloom. Real concerns that like the rural areas won't be able to grow stuff reliably and consistently in the future. So they'll need this. These facilities. And one of the big exciting things about what we're doing is Clackmannanshire, where we've got this project, is a deprived area, and it's about the green skills, the green growth, the jobs that will come with this, looking after the solar panels, working the vertical growing tower. So I don't want robots, I want people to go and do interesting things with it. So I think it's almost, so they will provide an advantage in urban areas where you can't grow normally, but I think that they could also have benefits for rural areas. So I don't see that as a tension as the rural areas get less resilient to food growth. So it's another string to a farmer's bow potentially to have lots. I think, well, for me, diversity is the key in farming. Probably as an individual farmer, if you've got all your eggs in one basket, that's a problem. So. Yes, that's a very simplified, non-farmery view. So,
yeah, I think I might say something controversial. So I think the farming community may well need to adapt, maybe fairly radically, away from, say, livestock, and maybe even away from food production in some places, and that might have losers. Most transformations have winners and losers potentially, but it should be the case, or it must be the case, that if this transformation is needed and has the the consequences of a healthier, more sustainable, etc., system, then society overall should be better off, and we should be able to kind of either compensate the losers, or it's not, and it's absolutely not that the rural land use is unimportant. It's actually becoming more and more and more and more important. We've got, we're looking for it to conserve biodiversity, to capture carbon, to produce food, to provide recreation, etc. So, public money for public goods is one way of thinking of it. But we should have ways, mechanisms. It should be within our ability to think of how we can transition the people who are currently managing the land to be managing the land in a different way. And yes, it may not look the same. It may not even be the same people, which is, I guess, slightly controversial part. but that it still can be beneficial to all.
Dr. Wu, do you want to come in here?
Yes, Marjorie, I actually hold similar idea with Peter. I think the innovation is a risky thing. Everyone knows that. Every innovator knows that. And the 1%, if 1% out of these innovations work, then we the society will gain much benefits from it. I think that the urban area is quite homogenized. It's not as diverse as the rural area. And people in the rural area, they have their own land and they're facing everyday decision based on what they see immediately, so that they can come up with solutions by themselves and try on site. I think this is a perfect scenario for the innovation happens because they have the instant feedback. I genuinely believe that to diversify the innovation efforts, that would bring loads of benefits to the final solution that we can find, because we have the big base of people who like to try new things, and they have the ability to try new things on their own farm.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Did we have one question before? Yeah, we have one at the back, then 1, 2, 3 here. Thank you.
Mine is actually just a quick comment, maybe even more than a question about the previous response to Jeff and Tilly about policy options. I think it's interesting because the first thing that I would have said is tax the rich, because poverty is the biggest, as you said, it's affordability, it's not accessibility. And so I wonder, like, when we're talking about interdisciplinarity, I think we just really need radically different disciplinary approaches, and also just, systems approaches to things. Like, I don't think that the number one policy option for food security is food related. I think it is very much just around finance and taxation and, redistribution of resource and income.
Redistribute the wealth, Greg.
Thank you. I think that was more of a comment than a question, and there's a round of applause for that. So we're getting to that point in the evening where we need the questions and answers to be shorter to give people more time. So one question here, one in the front row, another one in the front row, and then we'll see if we have time for any more. So short, please.
Chris Knowles from RPG. We've talked about the things that we can do personally to change our ways, but to benefit the poorest in society, it's a policy thing, and our food import policies would be to import the best quality and condition foods, and we have the sort of market powers to be able to buy the best quality and condition produce, outcompeting local markets. So as we improve food security for the poorest people here, we are sort of going to make it worse for the people who are providing and growing that food in their own countries. Have you got any thoughts about how we would redress that balance?
I mean, yeah, you're right in the sense that if we are importing food, then it's obviously not in those other countries that they're exporting it. It's not necessarily kind of a zero-sum game, however, that, countries are, getting revenue from those exports, and it could well be that they were taking advantage of climatic suitability for growing those crops where it's easiest to grow them. So international trade can be beneficial to all, to both sides. It doesn't have to be this kind of, I only win by you losing, which is sort of the premise of the question. That said, that there are opportunities for negative outcomes, and we have to be kind of mindful of that. I think one of the obvious examples in this sector from historically would be kind of CAP and previous payments where there was guaranteed guaranteed market prices, and that caused big distortions to international trade and countries not being able to export into our markets and various other negative outcomes. So, you know, I think it's something we need to be mindful of, but it's not a zero-sum game.
Either of you very quickly want to come into this? We've got 5 minutes for 2 more questions, so either of you want to chip in? No? Okay. Quick question, quick answer. Thank you.
It's a very quick question. Hello, Dr. Kate Smith. I'm actually a post-academic and I now run an ed tech business. But my PhD was in food security, as you know, because we spoke at the start. Amartya Sen said that all hunger is political. And your opening point was that we produce enough food to feed everybody. 3,600 calories each is produced every day, enough to feed everybody. Can the innovations we've talked about today do something to fix things like the derivative trading on food and the financialisation of the food system? Is it good? Because it would be a note for hope if the answer was yes.
Yes.
I agree with everything you said until the last sentence. There's enough food, and it's about how we choose to what we choose to do with that food, and it's political. Yes, I agree. I'm not sure to focus on derivative trading is necessarily the right emphasis. However, you know, it's about equality, like Lindsay was saying to some extent. And it's also about what we do with that food. You know, if we feed it to livestock, then that's going to result in losses. If we convert it to bioethanol, that's also not necessarily feeding people. So yeah, so it's systemic and about choices, ultimately.
Any other very quick comments? No? Last question, potentially. We'll keep an eye on the clock. Thanks.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
My name is Natalia Contreras. I'm a PhD in molecular plant sciences from the Botanic Garden at the University of Edinburgh. And my question is specifically directly to you, Rachel. Since you mentioned that the models and the numbers are saying that beef is not the best, I wonder if you have you find or know effective ways to communicate what these models say to the public outside academia, or do you know? Yeah.
Sorry, if I tried to persuade the public not to eat beef. Is that the...
Yeah, like taking this information outside the academic.
How do you persuade?
Yes. Okay, this is the perfect example of the interdisciplinarity, because it's such a kind of cultural... People feel entitled, I think. And I come from a family of dairy/beef farmers, so they'd be furious with me. And it's not as straightforward. You know, there are some forms of farming that are more environmentally friendly for cattle than others. So it's not, but it is the sort of obvious that because you put a lot of feed in to get the feed out. And I think even if you showed people the figures, they still go, but I want to eat a burger. And so it's really, really hard because it's cultural rather than, and I can show you as much maths as I like, until the world starts ending. So the really, really bad stuff happens and we go, that's because of the beef. I can't see, you have to keep changing a small number of people making small changes, is my view. So, you know, the sort of people that become vegan is a terrible phrase, but are often educated, rich, it's easier, it's an easier choice if you're in that world of being confident in your cooking and all those things than if you're poor and you're buying the cheapest thing and the thing that's easiest and your kids will eat and you're not having to worry about whether smiley faces is bad for them or for the planet because they'll eat smiley faces. So it's very complicated. And it's not just facts. If it was just facts, we'd have solved it a long time ago, I think.
I think on that provocative note, which is what this Peter Wilson lecture and event is always about, I'd like to encourage you to continue chatting with the speakers. I'm sure Dr. Wu Huan, you'll be available to chat to people as well. So in order to keep to time, I'll close the formal part of the event, but please do continue to talk to one another and to our speakers. So thank you very much to Rachel, Peter and Wu and all of you for such an interesting discussion tonight. It takes all of us to do that. If you want to catch up on tonight's event again and rerun it, there's many others as well on the RSC's YouTube channel, so please do Google that and have a mooch around. I'd like to thank the RSE team for organising, and particularly Talia at the back, who is the lead project manager for this event. And I think it's your 4th one you've done now, Talia, and the rest of the team who are behind the scenes. And also Mike, again, to embarrass him, as Peter Wilson's grandson, for coming along this evening. And Talia for finding him, I think, yes. So finally, thank you again. And one last round of applause to Rachel, Peter and Wu. Thank you.